What
What do you think
happens
about the
when
recent election
America's most
results?
polished
Well, it's
journalist
certainly a
collides with the
complex
royal
situation
family's
with a
most
lot of different
controversial
factors
export?
at play.
At first, it looks like just another primetime sit-down, a comfortable studio, polite greetings, and the illusion of civility. But beneath the warm lights of CNN, Anderson Cooper didn't come to play along, and Meghan Markle didn't come to be humbled. She came armed with defiance, dismissive smiles, and that sharp edge of entitlement that has polarized audiences worldwide. You know, the CNN studio gleamed under the carefully calibrated lights. Everything about the set was pristine. Anderson Cooper, the immaculate alignment of his cue cards, the deliberate stillness of the cameras, waiting to capture every angle. Across from him sat Meghan Markle, perfectly poised, legs crossed, her glossy hair catching the light like a halo. She offered that practiced smile that had graced countless magazine covers. The smile that seemed designed to disarm and charm. "You, Meghan," Anderson began smoothly. "Thank you for joining us tonight." "Of course," she said, her tone sweet, but laced with something faintly performative. "It's always enlightening to sit down with real journalists." Anderson caught the subtle sting in her words, but didn't bite. He only inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Let's begin with something simple. How are you and Harry doing?" You know? For a fleeting second, Meghan's smile froze, an almost imperceptible shift. Then she leaned back slightly, exuding a casual air. "We're fine. We're thriving. Stronger than ever. Actually, in spite of what the tabloids would love for people to believe." Her voice carried a sharp edge now, each syllable polished to sound definitive, even defensive. Anderson nodded, maintaining a steady gaze. "There have been rumors, some suggesting that there's tension in the marriage, that Harry struggles with being so far removed from his family, and that rumors—" Meghan cut in with a light laugh, though the laughter was brittle. "Do you really want to waste your time giving oxygen to gossip?" "Honestly, Anderson, I'd expect better of you." The studio audience, invited guests seated behind the cameras, shifted uncomfortably. The dismissal was pointed, almost disrespectful. Anderson, however, remained the picture of composure. "I understand your frustration with rumors," he said evenly. But part of the public's interest lies in how you both are adjusting, given the very public step you took away from royal life. Isn't it fair to ask how you're navigating those changes?" "Yeah." Meghan's smile tightened. "Navigating?" She repeated as though tasting the word. "We don't navigate. We lead. We've made choices that serve our happiness, our truth. If people can't handle that, perhaps they should stop projecting their unhappiness onto us." The words rang with condescension. What was meant to be an answer sounded more like a rebuke. Anderson's expression didn't flicker. He shuffled his cards slightly, a movement so subtle it was almost a silent challenge. "So, let's talk about choices. Then," he continued, "you've been vocal about your difficulties with the royal family. You've described feeling unsupported, even silenced, but you've also built a very successful platform since stepping away. Podcasts, streaming deals, book contracts. Critics argue that you've leveraged the very institution you condemn. What would you say to them?" "Ooh," Meghan tilted her head, the smile returning. Colder this time. "I'd say those critics should try walking a mile in my shoes before they make uninformed judgments. I don't apologize for surviving, Anderson. I don't apologize for making a living after being cut off." Her tone had grown sharper, louder. What had begun as a conversation was already teetering into confrontation. "You know," Anderson leaned forward, voice calm and measured. "But Meghan, it wasn't as if you were left destitute. You had a successful acting career before Harry. He has inherited wealth. The perception, fair or not, is that the narrative of financial struggle doesn't align with reality. How do you reconcile that?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Perception," she said, practically spitting the word. "That's the problem, isn't it? Everyone thinks they're entitled to analyze our lives like characters in a play. They don't know the truth. They don't know what we sacrificed. You know? Anderson let the silence breathe for a moment, letting the audience feel the weight of her indignation. Then softly, "What exactly did you sacrifice, Meghan?" The question landed like a stone dropped in still water. For the first time, Meghan hesitated. Her lips parted, but the words came slower now, less rehearsed. "Privacy," she said finally. "Peace. The right to live without being torn apart daily by people who have never even met us." "Eo," Anderson nodded thoughtfully, but there was a flicker of steel in his blue eyes. "Yet here you are, sitting in front of millions telling your story on your terms. Does that not contradict the desire for privacy?" Meghan bristled. "It's not contradiction. It's control. We choose what to share." "That's all right." Of course, Anderson agreed smoothly. "But that also makes you public figures who can be questioned on the choices you make. You can't ask for privacy and also command a global spotlight without scrutiny. That's the balance journalism demands." The audience hummed with tension. Meghan crossed her legs more tightly, her hands clasping together in her lap. The mask of charm was thinning, and something colder was seeping through. "Balance?" she echoed, her voice dripping disdain. "Funny, Anderson. You talk about balance. Yet, you sit there with the same smug authority as every other man who's ever tried to diminish me. You know?" Anderson blinked once slowly, but his voice remained calm, even gentle. "I'm not diminishing you, Meghan. I'm holding you accountable." "There's a difference." Her laugh was sharp, humorless. "Accountable to whom? To you? To the press that twists every word I say? To a public that's already made up its mind about me?" "You know," Anderson didn't raise his voice. "Accountable to the truth," he said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. The opening act of what was supposed to be a measured discussion had already ignited into a sparring match. And for the first time, Meghan's polished composure looked fragile. Anderson Cooper sat composed, pen poised between his fingers, while Meghan Markle's posture grew taut, her charm slipping. Anderson's next card was deliberate. He didn't glance at it. He already knew the question. "Meghan, let's talk about Harry. He's spoken often about the toll this has taken on him. The distance from his family, the loss of the military roles he once valued so deeply. How was he adjusting? You know?" Meghan's expression froze for a fraction of a second. Then came the practiced smile, though sharper now, like glass under light. "Harry is thriving. He's never been happier. Actually, we've built a life that finally reflects our values. So, no, Anderson, he's not pining for the past." "If that's what you're insinuating," Anderson nodded calmly. "I'm not insinuating, Meghan. I'm asking. There are reports." Anderson leaned forward slightly, his voice low, calm, but edged with unmistakable firmness. "It's not about control, Meghan. It's about the fact that before you, Harry was one of the most beloved members of the royal family. He had a role, a purpose, a deep connection with the British public. Since stepping away, much of that has eroded. So it's a fair question. Has your marriage cost him more than it's given him?" No." The question hung in the air like a live wire. Meghan's jaw tightened, and for the first time, her voice cracked with heat. "That is insulting. We are partners, equals. Harry didn't lose anything. He gained freedom. He gained love. He gained me." Yet Anderson's gaze didn't waver, and in exchange, he lost his family, his titles, his country's affection. Was that a trade worth making? Meghan's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You sound like one of those bitter royalists who thinks the crown is sacred. Let me remind you, Anderson, we're not living in the Strubath century. Harry doesn't need to bow and scrape for anyone's approval." There was an audible murmur from the studio audience. Her words, dripping with disdain, landed like a hammer blow. Anderson inhaled slowly, maintaining his poise. Let's pivot then. Before Harry, you had a successful acting career. Many people knew you from Suits. Do you ever regret leaving that behind? Walking away from a professional identity of your own? Oh, Megan tilted her head, smirking faintly. Regret? Hardly. I outgrew it. Playing dress-up on a TV set is nothing compared to the impact I've made on a global stage. I didn't trade down, Anderson. I traded up. The arrogance in her tone was unmistakable. Anderson's brows rose slightly, but his voice remained even. Some might argue you traded independence for notoriety, that you went from being Meghan Markle, actress, to Meghan and Markle, Duchess of Sussex, defined primarily by your husband's name. Megan's composure cracked again. That's sexist and reductive. I am more than my husband's wife. Of course, Anderson said smoothly. But without Harry, would you be sitting here on this stage in front of millions? Would Netflix and Spotify have offered those contracts? Would publishing houses have chased your story? Megan's lips tightened into a thin line. Her voice, when it came, was colder. You clearly don't understand who I am. I've always had influence. I've always had presence. The world just wasn't ready to acknowledge it until I forced them to. Anderson let the silence stretch, his calm demeanor only sharpening the contrast with her rising hostility. Then he asked softly but pointedly, or did the world only notice because of the crown attached to your name? The blow landed. Megan's eyes flashed, and her breath caught audibly in the microphone. She leaned forward now, her tone openly confrontational. You don't get to decide my worth, Anderson. And frankly, your line of questioning is insulting. Anderson leaned back, utterly composed, his voice dropping into that calm, deliberate cadence that had dismantled presidents and CEOs alike. I'm not deciding your worth, Meghan. I'm asking if the worth you claim was truly earned or borrowed. The audience collectively inhaled, the tension now electric. Megan's smile was gone, replaced with something colder, anger laced with fear. The cracks in her carefully constructed armor were beginning to show. And for Anderson, that was the first sign that the real interview had only just begun. The studio air had grown heavy. Meghan Markle sat rigid in her chair, lips pressed into a thin line. Her earlier veneer of charm stripped away. Anderson Cooper, by contrast, remained the picture of composure. His notes rested neatly on the desk, but he hardly needed them. He had the cadence of a man who knew exactly where this interview was headed. Megan, he began evenly. Let's address what so many people are wondering. You've spoken about the pain of your time and the royal family, but you've also enjoyed global recognition because of it. Without that platform, without the crown's name, do you believe the world would still be listening to you now? Megan's eyes narrowed. So what? You're saying I'm irrelevant without them? Anderson didn't flinch. I'm saying your voice was amplified by the institution you criticize. That's not judgment. It's fact. She leaned forward, her tone sharp. And I suppose you think I should have stayed silent. Endured racism, endured being ignored when I begged for help just so the monarchy's spotless image could stay intact. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing her rising hostility. Anderson's tone, however, remained maddeningly calm. I think there's a difference between speaking truth to power and building a brand around grievance. Many people respected your initial courage, but now some feel the story has become selective, crafted. Megan let out a bitter laugh. Selective? That's rich. Anderson, you sit there in your expensive suit behind your desk with your privilege, and tell me how to tell my story. Anderson's eyes never wavered. Privilege is being born into a monarchy with palaces, staff, and global adoration. And yet, the British public, who once welcomed you with open arms, now seems divided at best. Why do you think that is? Her jaw tightened. Because the British media poisoned them against me. It's that simple. Anderson leaned in slightly, voice firm but calm. Is it that simple? Or did the public's affection cool after decisions you made, walking away from duties, criticizing the Queen's institution while still using its titles, moving to America, sending lucrative media deals? Megan's eyes flashed. We had to move. We had to protect ourselves. From what? Anderson asked softly. From scrutiny? From responsibilities you agreed to when you married into that family? The words cut like glass, responsibilities. Anderson asked, voice even, you mean servitude? Ugh. You mean smiling and waving while being treated like a burden? That's not a life, Anderson. That's a prison. You know? Anderson let the silence stretch, then asked the question everyone in the room had been waiting for. Did Queen Elizabeth personally mistreat you? Meghan hesitated. A flash of calculation flickered across her face. Then came the dismissive smile. I have nothing but respect for the late Queen, she said, clipped, rehearsed. But the system she embodied, it was archaic, it was suffocating. Anderson's voice sharpened ever so slightly. So it wasn't her personally, it was the system, the monarchy. Exactly, Meghan said quickly, as if relieved to anchor herself in safer territory. Anderson nodded. And yet, it's the monarchy that gave you the platform, the attention, the influence. Without it, you were a supporting actress on a cable show. With it, you became a global figure. Does that not complicate your narrative? Her composure snapped. I don't need a crown to matter, Anderson. I never did. The monarchy needed me more than I needed them. I was the fresh air, the diversity, the modernity they couldn't produce on their own. Gaps rippled through the audience. The arrogance in her tone was undeniable. Anderson's lips pressed into a thin, measured line. That may be how you see it, but from the outside, it looks different. The monarchy has existed for centuries. You were there for less than 2 years before walking away. Do you truly believe you changed it, or did it change you? Her laugh was sharp, defensive. I opened eyes. I exposed truths. That's more than most could have done. Anderson leaned back in his chair, gaze steady. Or perhaps you burned bridges and called it revolution. The silence that followed was crushing. Anderson shuffled his notes, but didn't glance down. His gaze was steady, piercing. Let's move to your decision to settle in America. Some say it's hypocritical. You left Britain citing a desire for privacy, but here you've pursued podcasts, interviews, documentaries, each one amplifying the very attention you claim to despise. How do you reconcile that, Meghan's voice dripped disdain. It's called survival, Anderson. We were cut off. We had to provide for ourselves. Unlike the institution, nobody pays our bills anymore. Anderson's eyebrow lifted slightly, his voice still maddeningly polite. Except, of course, the streaming giants who paid tens of millions for your story. That doesn't exactly scream hardship. Meghan's cheeks flushed red. How dare you reduce everything we've endured to money? You think it's about wealth? It's about security, dignity, protecting our children. Anderson's reply was surgical. Protecting your children or protecting your brand? The blow landed hard. Meghan froze, lips parting, but no words coming. For the first time, she looked genuinely rattled. Anderson let the silence hang before speaking again. Softly, but decisively. Meghan, you left a 1,000-year-old institution, claiming you wanted peace. But what you've built looks less like peace and more like a business. No. The audience erupted into a low murmur, sensing the interview spiraling into dangerous territory. Meghan's face hardened, but her voice shook with indignation. You don't get to define me, she snapped. You don't get to decide what my life means. Anderson's gaze was unflinching. I don't need to. The world is watching, and they see the contradictions. The tension was now unbearable. The interview that began with smiles had become a battlefield, and Meghan Markle was losing ground with every question. Eh? The studio was silent, except for the faint hum of the lights. Meghan Markle sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. The glossy composure that had carried her through so many interviews was gone, replaced with flashes of anger and thinly veiled panic. Anderson Cooper, still calm and deliberate, leaned forward as though he were dissecting a case in open court. "Meghan," he began, voice measured, "you've spoken about being silenced, about suffering, about leaving an institution that failed you, but let's be honest with each other and with the viewers at home. Would we be sitting here right now if you hadn't married Prince Harry?" You know? The question hit like a thunderclap. The audience collectively inhaled. Meghan's eyes flashed, but she forced a smirk. "So now you're saying I'm nothing without him?" Anderson's gaze didn't waver. "I'm saying that your entire public identity, your global influence, your Netflix deals, your book contracts, all stem from one fact. You married into the most famous family in the world. And since leaving that family, you've built a career criticizing it while still trading on its name. Isn't that true?" "No." Meghan's voice rose sharp and defensive. "That's an incredibly sexist thing to say. I had a career before Harry. I was successful before Harry. I mattered before Harry." "You?" Anderson's reply was a scalpel delivered with devastating calm. "Yes, Meghan. You were an actress on a mid-tier cable show. Talented, perhaps, but not globally known. You became a household name the moment you put on that tiara and walked into Windsor. That's not sexism. That's reality." Her mouth opened, but no words came. The silence betrayed her. Anderson pressed on, his tone never rising, each word more cutting than the last. "You've made millions from interviews, documentaries, podcasts, all on the back of a name you claim to despise. You say you were silenced, yet no one has spoken more than you. You say you wanted privacy, yet you've lived in the spotlight by choice. You say you were powerless, yet you've leveraged enormous power in shaping the narrative. Meghan, do you see the contradiction?" Her composure cracked fully. "You don't understand what I've been through," she snapped, her voice trembling now. "You don't understand the pain, the isolation, the fear. You sit there judging me like you know my life, but you don't." Anderson leaned back, his face grave. "I understand what you've told us, and what I see is a woman who wants all the benefits of royalty with none of the responsibilities. A woman who says she's independent, but whose platform collapses without Harry's name. Strip away the crown, the titles, the connections, and what's left?" Meghan's lip quivered. She tried to steady herself, but her voice broke. "I am more than his wife. I am more than a duchess. She faltered, her eyes glistening. "I am." Her words dissolved into silence, and then, to the shock of everyone in the room, Meghan's eyes filled with tears. She turned her face away, blinking rapidly, her carefully composed persona shattering under the weight of the questions. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to pity her or applaud Anderson. Anderson's voice, still firm but tinged with finality, cut through the tension. "Meghan, this isn't cruelty. This is accountability. You've made accusations against powerful people who cannot defend themselves publicly. You've profited from those accusations. And when asked for specifics, for facts, for evidence, you fall back on emotion. That may win sympathy, but it doesn't answer the questions." Meghan shook her head, tears rolling now. "You don't know what it's like. None of you know." Anderson exhaled slowly, then turned his eyes toward the camera. His closing words carried the gravity of a verdict. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just seen what happens when public narratives meet hard questions. Titles and fame can amplify a voice, but they cannot replace substance. And without Harry's name, Meghan Markle would not be sitting here tonight. The words landed like a gavel. Meghan's head dropped, shoulders trembling, as Anderson placed his pen neatly on the desk. "This interview," he said quietly, "is over." The studio remained tense. The hum of the lights, the only audible sound. Meghan Markle sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. The polished composure that had carried her through so many interviews was gone, replaced by flashes of anger and thinly veiled panic. Anderson Cooper, still calm and deliberate, leaned forward, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "Yo, Meghan," he began, voice measured, "you've spoken about being silenced, about suffering, about leaving an institution that failed you. But let's be honest with each other and with the viewers at home. Would we be sitting here right now if you hadn't married Prince Harry? No." The question hit like a thunderclap. The audience collectively inhaled. Meghan's eyes flashed, but she forced a smirk. "So now you're saying I'm nothing without him?" Anderson's gaze didn't waver. "I'm saying that your entire public identity, your global influence, your Netflix deals, your book contracts, all stem from one fact. You married into the most famous family in the world. And since leaving that family, you've built a career criticizing it while still trading on its name. Isn't that true?" Meghan's voice rose sharp and defensive. "That's an incredibly sexist thing to say. I had a career before Harry. I was successful before Harry. I mattered before Harry." Yo. Anderson's reply was a scalpel delivered with devastating calm. "Yes, Meghan. You were an actress on a mid-tier cable show. Talented, perhaps, but not globally known. You became a household name the moment you put on that tiara and walked into Windsor. That's not sexism. That's reality." Her mouth opened, but no words came. The silence betrayed her. Anderson pressed on, his tone never rising, each word more cutting than the last. "You've made millions from interviews, documentaries, podcasts, all on the back of a name you claim to despise. You say you were silenced, yet no one has spoken more than you. You say you wanted privacy, yet you've lived in the spotlight by choice. You say you were powerless, yet you've leveraged enormous power in shaping the narrative. Meghan, do you see the contradiction? You know?" Her composure cracked fully. "You don't understand what I've been through," she snapped, her voice trembling now. "You don't understand the pain, the isolation, the fear. You sit there judging me like you know my life, but you don't." Anderson leaned back, his face grave. "I understand what you've told us, and what I see as a woman who wants all the benefits of royalty, with none of the responsibilities. A woman who says she's independent, but whose platform collapses without Harry's name. Strip away the crown, the titles, the connections, and what's left?" Meghan's lip quivered. She tried to steady herself, but her voice broke. "I am more than his wife. I am more than a duchess. I..." She faltered, her eyes glistening. "I am." Her words dissolved into silence. You know? And then, to the shock of everyone in the room, Meghan's eyes filled with tears. She turned her face away, blinking rapidly, her carefully composed persona shattering under the weight of the questions. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to pity her or applaud Anderson. Anderson's voice, still firm but tinged with finality, cut through the tension. "Meghan, this isn't cruelty. This is accountability. You've made accusations against powerful people who cannot defend themselves publicly. You've profited from those accusations. And when asked for specifics, for facts, for evidence, you fall back on emotion. That may win sympathy, but it doesn't answer the questions." Meghan shook her head, tears rolling now. "You don't know what it's like. None of you know." "Io?" Anderson exhaled slowly, then turned his eyes toward the camera, His closing words carried the gravity of a verdict. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just seen what happens when public narratives meet hard questions. Titles and fame can amplify a voice, but they cannot replace substance. And without Harry's name, Meghan Markle would not be sitting here tonight. The words landed like a gavel. Meghan's head dropped, shoulders trembling, as Anderson placed his pen neatly on the desk. "This interview," he said quietly, "is over." The studio air seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, there was no sound but the faint whir of cameras and the rustle of crew members adjusting their equipment. The audience remained frozen, uncertain whether to react with shock, pity, or vindication. The carefully curated persona of Meghan Markle had unraveled before their eyes, leaving only raw emotion and the weight of accountability. Anderson remained seated, composed, his notes untouched. The calm precision of his demeanor contrasted sharply with Meghan's fraying composure. The questions had been delivered not as personal attacks, but as instruments of truth, designed to probe beyond the surface charm, and carefully crafted narratives. And Meghan, for all her defenses and rehearsed poise, had revealed cracks in her carefully constructed image. "Tonight," Anderson said softly, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio and into homes across the nation, "you witnessed a reckoning. The story you've been following for years is complex, layered, and yes, controversial. But journalism is not about loyalty to a narrative or comfort in popularity. It's about truth. Sometimes that truth is uncomfortable, and sometimes it requires those in the spotlight to confront their choices openly, without deflection." Meghan's tears streamed down her cheeks, her breathing uneven. She had come prepared with defiance, charm, and dismissive smiles, but each layer of control had been peeled away under the weight of scrutiny. The questions had been precise, deliberate, and unyielding, leaving no room for evasive answers. Anderson leaned back slightly, pen resting on the desk, and addressed the camera one final time. Titles and fame can amplify a voice, but they cannot replace substance. Without the institution you criticize, without the platform that brought you global attention, would your story carry the same weight? That is the question each viewer must consider, and the answer, as tonight has shown, is far from simple. The camera slowly zoomed out. The screen faded to black, leaving millions of viewers stunned, captivated, and deeply engaged. Some felt sympathy, others a sense of vindication. But all knew they had just witnessed one of the most explosive interviews in CNN history. The clash between narrative and accountability had played out in real time, leaving an indelible mark on public perception. Anderson's final words lingered in the minds of viewers everywhere. Influence can open doors, amplify voices, and capture attention, but it cannot replace truth. Without context, without accountability, without a willingness to confront uncomfortable questions, even the most polished public figures can be revealed as fallible, human, and subject to scrutiny. The studio remained heavy with the echoes of confrontation. The polished lights of CNN that had once framed the interview with warmth now seemed to cast shadows over the intensity of the moment. Meghan Markle sat slumped slightly, hands resting limply on her lap, eyes glistening with tears, the carefully crafted persona she had arrived with. Now fractured. Anderson Cooper, still composed, allowed a pause before addressing the camera, his tone deliberate, calm, but edged with undeniable gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you've just witnessed more than a conversation. This was a reckoning. A public figure, with global recognition and influence, faced questions not designed to flatter, but to hold her accountable. We've explored narratives choices, and consequences. And sometimes the truth isn't neat. It's uncomfortable, complicated, and far from the polished versions we see in magazines or streaming deals. Eh. Meghan's lips trembled as she tried to regain composure. She drew a shallow breath, her voice quiet but still defiant. You think you understand, Anderson, but you don't. None of you do. I've been judged, criticized, vilified for living my life in a way that seeks happiness and truth. I've had to fight for recognition, respect, and the right to tell my own story. Everything I've done has been questioned, dissected, and distorted. How is that fair? Anderson inclined his head, his expression neutral, voice steady. Fairness in life is often subjective, Meghan, but the fairness in journalism is objective scrutiny. Your actions, your choices, your public statements, they carry weight, influence perception, and impact millions. When someone takes that platform, they also take on the responsibility of accountability. It's not a personal attack. It's a measure of transparency. The audience shifted, sensing the raw honesty in the room. The tension had shifted from confrontation to reflection. Meghan's eyes darted to the cameras, then back at Anderson, her voice now quieter, a touch of vulnerability creeping in. I only ever wanted to be seen as myself, to live authentically. But every step has been questioned. Every moment has been under a microscope. And now you tell me that even the platforms built to amplify truth are judged for their own success? It feels like there's no end to the scrutiny. Anderson leaned forward slightly, voice calm yet unwavering. Scrutiny is inevitable, especially when influence is involved. On your story, your life, and your choices are public, not because of you alone, but because of the intersection with history, culture, and institutions that millions care about. The question isn't about whether you deserve privacy or fame. It's about understanding that visibility brings accountability. And that is a reality every public figure must face. Meghan swallowed hard, her composure thinning further. I've fought to reclaim my narrative, to create platforms that allow me to speak freely, to protect my family, and to ensure that the truth of our experience is not forgotten or misrepresented. And yet, the moment we do, it's met with suspicion and judgment. Where is the balance between truth and expectation? Anderson's gaze softened slightly, voice gentle but firm. The balance is not always comfortable, Meghan. It's measured in transparency, responsibility, and acknowledgement of the impact your actions have on others. Speaking truth to power is commendable. But when that truth is presented selectively or without context, it opens the door to scrutiny. The audience sees the contradictions, and the questions follow naturally. This is the nature of accountability. Meghan's hands clenched briefly, then relaxed as she leaned back, her voice barely above a whisper. I understand the point you're making, Anderson, but it doesn't lessen the pain, the isolation, or the judgment. It doesn't erase the experiences I've endured or the sacrifices I've made. Anderson nodded, voice resolute yet measured. No, it doesn't erase them, but it frames them. It allows the public to see not just the narrative presented, but the complexities behind it. Influence, fame, and recognition are tools. How those tools are used and how they intersect with accountability defines legacy as much as the story itself. The studio fell silent. The audience absorbed the weight of the exchange, the tension of the confrontation, now giving way to introspection. Meghan's gaze softened for a fleeting moment, acknowledging the truth in the words, yet still guarded, still fiercely protective of the person she was behind the public figure. Anderson concluded, voice calm, tonight we've seen a rare glimpse behind the polished exterior, the carefully constructed public persona. We've seen emotion, defiance, and the difficult truths of living in the global spotlight. The lesson is clear. Influence amplifies voice, but it also magnifies responsibility. The audience doesn't just consume stories, they interpret them, judge them, and learn from them. And for every story told, accountability remains the cornerstone of credibility. You know, Meghan sat quietly, eyes downcast, a mix of exhaustion, frustration, and reflection etched on her face. The cameras rolled silently, capturing a moment of revelation, a confrontation that was more than just an interview. It was a reflection on power, narrative, and the human complexity behind fame. Kiddo? Anderson placed his pen neatly on the desk, looking directly into the camera one final time. Titles and recognition can open doors, amplify voices, and command attention, but they cannot replace substance. Influence without accountability is fleeting. Tonight, we've seen the interplay between privilege, narrative, and scrutiny. And the message is universal. The truth, no matter how uncomfortable, demands to be confronted. You know, the screen slowly faded to black. The studio lights dimmed. Viewers everywhere were left with the weight of the conversation, the collision of perception and reality, and the stark lesson that power and visibility come with responsibility. Some felt empathy, others vindication, but all understood that in the court of public scrutiny, no one escapes accountability.